Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catalyze Yourself. I'm your host, Gayatri, and today we are exploring something that shapes every interaction we have, every belief we hold, every choice we make, and many times without us even realizing it. We are talking about perception, that filter through which we experience the world and even our own selves. We've heard this phrase, perception is reality. And while it might sound like an oversimplification, it does hold a powerful truth. Most of the time, we are not responding to what is happening. We are responding to how we are perceiving is happening. And perception is shaped by our conditioning, by past experiences, by inherited beliefs, by our nervous system's learned responses, and sometimes by the stories we didn't even realize we were telling ourselves. We edit our behavior because not because somebody asked us to, because we have perceived that being fully ourselves might not be welcomed. We over explain because we perceive potential judgment. We hold back, we perform, we people please, we overcompensate. Not always because it's true, but because our perception feels true. And when it feels true, it becomes reality for us. So today's episode is an invitation not to erase our perceptions, not to judge our perceptions, but to look at them more clearly, to understand where they come from, to ask, is this my truth or my training? Is this a moment of presence or projection? And what becomes possible when I begin to perceive with clarity instead of assumptions and fears and old patterns. And this is where the SIRE models becomes not just a compass, but a clarifier. It gives a structure for how we can move through perception. So we are not reacting to the world through a distorted view. We are relating to it with presence. Through self-awareness, we learn to observe what we are perceiving and where it's even coming from. Through self-inspiration, we reconnect to what truly matters beneath all the noise, the fear, and the projections. Through self-regulation, we interrupt the urge to react when our perception is getting hijacked by our emotional responses. Through self-expression, we find a way to communicate and respond from alignment. And this inner system is brought to life through our practices of halt, rise, and shift. The practices that is actually activating perception in real time. Halt helps us recognize when what we are seeing may be shaped by fatigue, fear, or conditioning. And rise gives us that pause to return to presence before we just react. And shift gives us the tools to act from clarity, even when the past wants to lead the present. And what makes it all sustainable is self-reflection. Because perception shifts, but reflection helps us stay aware of how it is shifting. It reminds us to ask, am I seeing what is actually here or what I expect to see or would prefer to see? So let's begin. Let's talk about perception, not as something to fix, not as something to judge, but simply as a lens. We are allowed to clean, we are allowed to adjust, and we are allowed to reclaim, to see ourselves and others with honesty, vulnerability, care, and clarity. And what perception asks us is to recognize that most of us are not seeing the moment we are in. We are seeing a version of it that is shaped by our memory, our emotions, our expectations, and the meaning that we have carried forward with us. Perception is such an active process within our mind. It's constantly interpreting, assigning value, and projecting what feels safest or most familiar to us. And often that moment we are reacting to is not what is in front of us, it's what we think it means. That silence, we could perceive it as dismissal. That question, we could perceive it as doubt. That shift in tone, we could take it personally before we even look at it contextually. And just as often, we are not just perceiving others, we are trying to manage how they perceive us. We over explain, we rehearse, we retreat, we protect, not because we are being disingenuous, but because our perceptions have already scripted out what we fear might happen if we are not fully seen. To gain clarity within our perception, we have to learn how to move away from distortion and ask ourselves, what am I perceiving here? What am I assuming? What am I projecting? And what am I trying to avoid or prove? And in those moments, we begin applying the inner structure we've been practicing all along. Self-awareness helps us notice the lens we are looking through, and whether that lens was chosen by us, learned by us, or inherited by us. Self-inspiration reconnects us to what actually matters, not just how we are seen, but who we want to be in the moment, and not as a performance for ourselves or for others. Self-regulation allows us to hold what we are feeling without needing to act from it, to sit with the discomfort without distorting the story. And self-expression gives us a way to engage with others that is less about managing perception and more about showing up with truth, clarity, and care. But none of this live in isolation. They are sustained by that quiet, reflective space we create around them. It's in self-reflection that we begin to recognize patterns in how we perceive. When do I tend to misread the room? What part of me gets triggered when silence enters a conversation? Where am I editing myself, not out of discernment, but out of fear? Reflection is what allows us to be honest, not just about what we are seeing, but how we are seeing. And that vulnerable honesty becomes the starting point, the beginning of clarity. And once we begin to notice that our perception is not fixed, that it is shaped, patterned, and often conditioned, something subtle happens. We stop trying to force clarity and we start creating the space for clarity to enter. And we must keep this in mind also. Clarity doesn't usually arrive as a lightning bolt, it arrives in quiet ways, as a moment of pause before a reaction, as a shift in tone before projection. And it could be the willingness to see more than just what confirms old narratives. And these moments, they are made possible not by you knowing more and more, but simply by you being present with what is happening inside of us as much as what is happening around us. This is where our practices of halt, rise, and shift begin to activate the work we've already grounded ourselves in. Halt is helping us to pause when perception has taken over, when our assumptions are spiraling, when we've started reacting more to the narrative in our head than the person sitting right in front of us. Hesitation might show up as overthinking. Avoidance might look like disengagement. Lack might sound like they're not going to like me or understand me. They don't even know the real me. And tiredness might feel like shutting down before the conversation has even started. Halt doesn't fix the perception. It helps us recognize we have moved far away from clarity, that we are in a distorted space. And that pause, that is where choice re-enters. And rise comes in to support us as we return to the present moment, to our body, to our values. The recognition that lets us catch, I'm seeing this through my old story. And then the intention that tells us what matters right now is that I come back into my own connection, not try and control it. And our senses that will help ground us It could be, oh, my feet is feeling the steadiness of the ground beneath me. I can stay in the moment, in the now. And evaluation, that introspective moment that lets you adjust in real time. Am I responding to my center or my conditioning? Rise gives us the presence to see again, not just with our eyes, but with our whole self. And shift is how we choose differently, not with force, just alignment. We stop, we name the distortion, we integrate the insight, and we flow back into the moment, not trying to be perfect, just trying to be real. And this is how perception transforms from a distorted reality to consistent clarity and through consistent intention. When we pause, we see more clearly. When we reflect, we respond more compassionately. When we lead ourselves gently, we stop projecting our fears and start perceiving through our presence. So much of this conversation could sound abstract until we take a moment to pause and ask, where has this shown up in my life? And the answer for most of us will be everywhere, because we are always perceiving the tone someone used, the pause in their reply, the silence in a meeting, the expression on a face. We perceive not just facts, but meaning. And we do it through filters that's shaped by everything that we know, we feared, we hoped for. And just as often, we are being perceived, sometimes for who we truly are, and sometimes through someone else's lens, distorted by their own unspoken story. And for me, the earliest signs and insights into perception came from how deeply I valued fairness. For as long as I can remember, even as a child, even as a teen, even as a young adult, I did not want to assume the worst of people. I wanted them to show me who they were. I did not want to respond based on projections. There was something in me that instinctively resisted making meaning without my understanding. And this has stayed with me throughout my adult life and even up to now. At the time, I did not have a name for this. But when I look back now, I see the roots of what would eventually become the SIRE model. Not because I had a system already, but it's because I lived the questions in my mind. And I was trying to lead myself with awareness even before I even knew to call it that. And over time, what I was sensing just became clearer. I was trying to stay self aware when the narratives of the world wanted to take over. I was trying to stay connected to my true values and to be inspired from within me, even when the external cues pulled me in all kinds of different directions. I was trying to regulate how I responded and not be suppressed or explode, but to stay grounded. And I was trying to express with integrity, to speak and act from a place that was vulnerably honest and constructive, even when it was not easy. And at the time, I would just simply categorize it as I'm just not everyone's cup of tea. That misfit mindset, which I now know was just me asking myself to truly learn about who I am so I could live authentically. And yet, even as I tried not to project onto others, I began to see another layer. I was letting their projections land on me. I wasn't pushing back. I was absorbing assumptions. I would change my tone, second guess my stance, or hold back, not because I was unclear, but because I did not want to be misunderstood. There was a deeper form of self-leadership that was needed that I was beginning to recognize. And I recognized it and I worked through it. And that is how I now know and recognize as the blueprint that makes up the SIRE model. Through working on my self-awareness, I recognized that I was shrinking in response to perception, not truth. Coming into myself for my inspiration, I reminded myself of my own values that I wanted to lead with integrity, not approval. My intention to provide space for my mind to be regulated gave me the space to hold steady, to not overcorrect or over explain. And my determination to express myself in a way that was intended not to convince others, but rather to remain true to myself, helped me speak to my center and my aligned self. And the time, these were raw elements for me. Through the years of reflection, through noticing of my patterns and supporting the growth of others and myself, in time, those elements took form. They became the blueprint within the SIRE model. And it didn't stop there. Because SIRE took space and shape in my own life, the surrounding ecosystem of self reflection became the place where I began to witness these shifts more consciously, where I could see how my internal blueprint was changing the way I saw, responded, the way I led. And anytime I recognized instances where my perception might be distorted, I applied what would eventually become the practices that sustain the SIRE model. HALT showed me the patterns, the fatigue, the overfunctioning, the hesitation that came not from doubt, but from trying to manage how I would be seen. RISE helped me reconnect. I began pausing before a conversation, asking what is true for me here, not what I'm afraid they'll think, not what they might expect, but what is my intention in this moment. Shift allowed me to change the behavior, to hold my expression steady, not in defiance, purely in clarity, not shrinking, not overcompensating, just choosing to stay aligned. And these practices became reminders for me for how to keep my perception as clear as I possibly could, not conceptually, in real time, in real moment to moment, experiencing our living. So while that was a personal journey, one shaped over time through quiet self inquiry and reflection, I have seen this show up just as vividly in my coaching work. Because perception doesn't just shape how we move through life, it shapes how we lead. And how often the greatest breakthroughs come when someone begins to recognize that how they're perceiving a person or a situation or even themselves is where an opportunity is. It's just what they've been carrying, not necessarily what they need to be working with. Let me share a coaching moment that brought this into clear focus that happened quite recently. One of my clients, a senior leader in a global organization, came to me with a very specific pattern. In team settings, particularly under pressure, he often assumed that his peers saw him as indecisive or behind. No one had said this to him directly. There were no explicit critiques, but his perception was shaped by moments that happened much earlier in his career. Moments when he got overlooked, interrupted, dismissed. And those past experiences had conditioned a lens that he was now carrying, through which he now viewed every leadership moment. And this came out when things were stressful. When there was tension in the room, that is when the lens pulled up for him. Then he started seeing the meaning of what was happening as everyone around potentially being disappointed in him. When peer asked a question and he heard it as a critique. When he was not the first to speak, he assumed others saw him as lacking authority. Yes, there was insecurity that was being fed by this perception, shaped by his projection that happened to him through a story that happened a long, long time ago. His inner lens had been trained by past dynamics, and now it's filtering his present in a way that was eroding his executive presence. In our early sessions, we didn't jump to reframe. Where I worked with him on is to slow down, to see. And that's where Sire began to illuminate his experience. We worked on his focus on self awareness and helped him recognize this internal narrative he was having. It was going something like, I'm being judged. They think I'm behind. I'm not showing up strongly enough. Then we dove into identifying his self inspiration. What is it that would allow him to reconnect with the values that has always guided his leadership, which were thoughtfulness, inclusivity, strategic thinking? These should not just show up when everything is peaceful and calm. How can you have that inspiration remain when you are facing a stressful moment? Because that is what is needed. And that has nothing to do with being the loudest voice in the room. Then we worked on reinforcing his self regulation to help him stay steady in meetings, techniques that could keep him regulated even when an old memory, emotion, thought, perception, discomfort surfaced. He learned to pause before responding. He started practicing slowing down to check with himself before making assumptions, asking himself before he made assumptions. And how he expressed himself began to shift. He moved away from trying to prove credibility to showing clarity. He started asking questions not from defensiveness, but from grounded curiosity. And this was what he focused on practicing every time he became aware that he's moving into a stressful place. And over time, what began as internal noticing became a structured rhythm for him. And the practices of halt, rise, and shift was walking him through it. Halt helped him catch the signal, the hesitation before speaking, the tightening in his chest, the thought loop he was having that they don't respect me. That was his cue. Rise gave him a way to return. He would reconnect to his intention. I want to lead with steadiness. He would start focusing on his breath, his body, and check whether he was leading from clarity or from a fear-based projection. And he shifted to a moment-to-moment practice. He would stop the internal spiral, highlight what was true, and they remind himself they're just asking a question, not attacking me, and integrate that awareness by responding with presence, not reacting, just grounded participation. And his self reflection in his day to day moments and in the space we created weekly, he began to see his progression, not just in performance, but in perception. There were some weeks he would come back and let me know, this week I stayed in the conversation a lot longer. I noticed I didn't shrink when the tone got sharp. I caught my projection and chose to stay with what was actually happening. And through that reflection, he started to rewrite his lens. His inner system was no longer filtered through past hurt, it was guided by the current truth. And that is how his perception started to shift from distortion to discernment. And don't get me wrong, this is not a perfect practice. We are human beings. It is a consistent practice that we need to do, because there will be times when we fall back and then we bring halt, rise, and shift and we move forward. That is just how we give ourselves grace, and we can move forward as we keep continuing to get stronger. So before we close today, let's pause together, take a breath, and ask gently, where have I been viewing something or someone through the lens of distorted perception? Where might I be reacting, not just to the reality in front of me, but to the story I've attached to it? And just as importantly, where have I allowed someone else's projection to color how I see myself? This is not about assigning blame or fault. This is not about regret or judgment. It is about remembering that perception is shaped and it can also be reshaped. And we have that power. When we live in awareness, When we reflect with intention and we practice with presence, we don't just see differently, we begin to live differently. So, as you move through this week, notice. Notice the moments when your assumptions get loud. Notice when your emotions spike before clarity even arrives. Notice when judgment towards yourself or someone else starts writing the story. And in that moment, pause, reflect, choose the lens that gives you clarity, one that aligns with what's true, not with what you've always known or what's familiar. And that's how you lead yourself and others from an integrated, whole, centered space. And next week, we'll take this exploration one step deeper. In episode 17, we focus on leading from within. We'll explore the quiet difference between the self we are conditioned to become and the self that is already aligned, aware, and whole, not to control who we are, but to trust who we have always been growing towards. Thank you for joining me today. I am Gayatri, and I'm grateful for the time you share here every single time. And until next time, keep noticing gently, keep choosing presence intentionally, and keep leading yourself one breath, one shift, one clear moment at a time.